Good morning. Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to start this last day of our school. Today we have the Module 4, Cult on Equality and Critique in an Interdependent World. We will start just now with a lecture by my friend and colleague Marcos Nobre. Then we have a second lecture, and in the afternoon we have also a round table. And of course a closing session for the whole school. So Marcos Nobre, I suppose that most of you know him very well, but it's my task, but also my pleasure to introduce him. He's a professor of philosophy at the State University of Campinas, also a researcher at Cebrap, as well as a researcher 1B. What this means is for Brazilians, of course, concept, not really for me, but so I'm just repeating these classifications. And he's also, last but not least, a co-speaker of Merila, which is the Maria Sibylla Merian Center Conviviality Inequality in Latin America. He's trained in social science and philosophy at this University of São Paulo and also at Humboldt Universität zu Berlin. He has been visiting and professor and also visiting researcher at several international universities, including University of California, Berkeley, University of Frankfurt, University of Chicago, and also Paris 1, Sorbonne, University of Leipzig, and also the Humboldt University in Berlin, and also the Université d'Orléans, Clermont-Ferrand. His main areas of interest are critical theory and political philosophy. And on these issues, he has published vastly several books and edited volumes, as well as several articles in outstanding journals and volumes. I'd like to highlight just the last piece from his long list of contributions, which is the forthcoming book expected to appear in April, on Hegel, with the wonderful title Como Nasce o Novo. That is, there is some issues how to translate this title into English, but I would say how the new arises. As perhaps some of you know, German sociologists of knowledge used to establish a very strict distinction between public prominence and academic reputation, insisting that both are somehow contradictory, meaning you are either, you have either academic reputation or you are a public personality. Marcos Nobre is one of the few exceptions to this rule, meaning he's a political columnist and also, besides his brilliant academic career, he's also a commentator in television, working for vehicles such as Folha de São Paulo, Valor Econômico, Revista Época, no longer, I know, and TV Cultura. As his academic publications, his media contributions demonstrate very well the necessity and also the power of critique, especially in these difficult times we are recently facing in Latin America, but also elsewhere. Formats and tasks of critique in the framework of critical theory is at the core of the lecture today. Welcome, dear Marcos, and thank you so much for joining in SPASS and also for sharing with us your research and reflections. We are looking very much forward to listen to you and also to discussing with you after the lecture.
Okay. Thanks, Sergio. It's great to have a friend who writes your introduction. It's always a pleasure. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank Professor Tavares de Almeida for the invitation, for organizing all this, Marta Machado, and all the people who were organizing this great conference. Today I'll talk to you about a very specific theoretical tradition. I'll talk about critical theory. And I thought that in the context of a school, it would be great to talk about the history and the development of critical theory. But at the same time, I know that this would be too much, because this would imply to begin with Marx and maybe with German idealism and go along 2 centuries until today. So it's impossible. And this is one thing I want to do. The other thing is how can we see this tradition critically? So what has this tradition to say to us today? So both tasks are really difficult ones to mix together. That's what I will try to do today. So I'll put some landmarks for us that we can discuss later if you want. So I began with part of my title, with critical theory. So it's not usual in the Anglophone world to talk about critical theory. You would normally hear Frankfurt School. And this is also the case for France, for instance. But it's changing in France too. So in France they say the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, so that you can mix both. And in the US particularly, you have critical theory as a kind of methodology for cultural studies. So there is some problems with this concept. I would like to say that the German word and what I want to do is critical theory. That is to say, Frankfurt School is a particular name that was used for a particular context. That is to say, when you talk about Frankfurt School, it's weird for me because most of the time they were not in Frankfurt and they were not a school. So it's weird as an expression. But it was important as a political label in the 1950s and the 1960s and even in the 1970s for the intervention in the public debates. So Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse and other critical theorists, they used this label to amplify their voices in the public debate, as to say, well, we are a school, you know, we are an army, we are like many, many people. So, but this label has already paid. We have already paid the tribute to this label, so I won't use it here. What I understand as critical theory is a strand from Marxism that appeared particularly in the 1930s when Max Horkheimer took the head of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt. This is a particular strand of Marxism. And the name critical theory has a lot to do with the characteristics of this trend, and I will try to talk about that today. So, I don't want to lose sight of my questions. And I will zigzag somewhat during my presentation. So I would like to put to you the landmarks of my presentation so that it would be easier to follow what I'm trying to present here. So, for starters, I would like to make the following distinction between critical theory and traditional theory. That's a famous text by Max Horkheimer from the year 1937, and I will summarize it in a brief paragraph. So, critical theory was born, so to say, practical. So, its birth was Karl Marx. Says that the theory is a true theory is one that consciously elaborates the necessary assumption of all knowledge production. And in the case of critical theory, that means it assumes that we live in a world that's dominated by capital, and that capitalism is the first historic formation that presents us with the possibility of overcoming domination. So if you have a domination-free possibility, domination-free society outside, this should be what drives your efforts in theory. That's to say also that if you don't take the stand and take a stance about this particular point, if you do not consciously elaborate the fact that you live in a world that is dominated by capital, that means that you make traditional theory. So that is to say that you fight for scientific objectivity in the sense that you don't feel affected by the fact that this is a world dominated by capital, and that it would be possible to build a society that's free of domination. So this implies also a very specific claim, and I gave a name to it. It's called the Non Concurrence Claim. So critical theory claims that it's not in competition with traditional contributions. And why is that? Because it puts itself in a different soil than traditional theories. This expression, soil, comes from a work of Georg Lukács, History and Class Consciousness, that was published in 1923. So this kind of way of dividing tradition and critical theory will be important during my talk. So such a stance has some major requirements. The first requirement is that of an union of theory and practice. So if theory is directed by and to emancipation from domination, then the consequence is that practice and theory make one thing, and we should bring them always together. So this is a very important requirement. The non-concurrence claim also implies that you have to have in the theory the idea of trends, to unveil trends of the historical development, so that you can say that these historical trends, they have in themselves also potentialities for domination and blockages for potentialities for emancipation, and blockages for emancipation. So that you can make what we call in this tradition a diagnosis of time. So this is also something that comes from history and class consciousness. Lukács says in this book, the knowledge of the present is the preeminent aim of Marxism. So that's what Marxism should do, to know the present. So that means also that critical theory is not in search for metaphysical truths or scientific objectivity in the sense of traditional theory. So, having such main features of the critical theoretical field in mind, I would like to point out to you what I see as the deficits of the critical theoretical tradition in the present time, so that we can look at this development and see how we could fix that. So, these are my claims for today. It's a bit weird here because it's always sleepy. So, the first one is that I see in the development of critical theory a progressive devaluation of the practice of the diagnosis of time. So more and more I see critical theorists looking at more abstract frameworks and more abstract theories. I'll talk about that. These theories because these theories, these abstract theories, they dangerously rub shoulders with traditional theories. So I see a danger here that critical theory becomes traditional theory. So this is the first point. The second point would be, instead of a dispute between different diagnoses of time, that's what is mainly what critical theory does. There is no consensus in this field. The only consensus is that we have to have orientation to emancipation. After that, that's only harsh debates about what would be the good path to follow. So, and progressively, what we have is a dispute between theories, and not a dispute between diagnosis of time. And furthermore, the second claim has a consequence, and I see that as the pathology of academia. That is to say, critical theory, when it becomes institutionalized, as it is today, like some possible field of research in universities, it becomes more and more like traditional theories. It puts itself in the academic competition. And this is a very dangerous pathology for critical theory. My third claim is to say that in its development, critical theory lost the idea of a strong concept of domination. So it put aside the centrality of the concept of domination. I hope that you see that these elements are intertwined. So if you abandon or if you put in a secondary plan the diagnosis of time, that means that also your concept of domination is secondary now. And as a fourth element, a fourth claim I'll make of the deficits of this tradition in my view is that something that was particular to critical theory, that is to say, a way of treating domination. And I would say treating domination as subjectivation of domination. So this idea that you have to look, how subjects are constituted and how domination constitutes subjects. This was really one of the main original points of this tradition. And this is also lost today, in my view. So these are my main claims today. So some of the main markers I want to put forward here for this trajectory today would be then, first, a model that was built in the 1930s with Max Horkheimer at the head of the Institute for Social Research, and which is called Interdisciplinary Materialism. This is what was done by Horkheimer and other members of the Institute in the 30s. This is a model, a long-lasting model for this tradition. And this innovative model, to talk about interdisciplinarity in the 30s, was really something very innovative. And it was done in the field of Marxism. So this model presented some peculiarities. One of them was that what is called the critique of political economy, what Marx has done, was taken as a common language for this interdisciplinary collaboration. So this is a very important feature of this model. Besides that, you have the objective of producing the most complex diagnosis of time that are possible. They presented a strong concept of domination, and they were oriented to the idea that research should be guided to subjectivation of domination. So I see that all the elements that I pointed out that are lacking today, in my view, or insufficiently developed, they were present in this original model. So what happened? What happened in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, and so on? So next step would be to say that in the 40s, the most famous book of this period is The Dialectic of Enlightenment from Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. That this model, sometimes you will hear that this model was the abandonment of the interdisciplinarity. And I would say that that's not true. It's just another way of trying to put forward interdisciplinarity. And the peculiarity of this model, in my view, in the 40s, is that Horkheimer and Adorno, they tried to substitute the critique of political economy as the common language for collaboration. This is the peculiarity of the dialectic of enlightenment. I don't have time to develop this. I would just briefly say that Horkheimer and Adorno, they were offering a new anthropology as the new common language for collaboration. That means that you don't have a basis agreement anymore in this field over the common language for collaboration. If you don't have that, then you are in trouble. Because this was the moment when the struggle over the best theory, in the sense of the best proposal for a common language for collaboration, started. And from then on, every single critical theorist wants to give first her or his theory. That is to say, her or his proposal for the language for common collaboration. And then they would discuss which is the best diagnosis of time, what is the best concept of domination, and so on. So this is a very dangerous way of competing in the critical theoretical field, because you are competing to say, well, I am the new Marx. So I have the new language for collaboration. Just follow me, and everything will be fine. But despite of this dangerous move that was made by dialectic of enlightenment, dialectic of enlightenment still had a very strong and central concept of domination. And one could also fairly say that this concept of domination was directed to the processes of subjectivation of domination. Even if it's one-sided, it's always how the system or reason or something like that builds the individual, builds the subject. You can fairly say that this book is oriented to the subjectivation of domination. And also important, you have a very strong diagnosis of time there. And to say, well, this is where we are, this is the trend for the future. If you want to make research or if you want to go to practice, these are the guidelines for you. So, despite of the move initiated by the dialectic of enlightenment in 1947, there are two editions of it, but we normally take the 47 edition as basis. Despite of this move, there were the other three elements, they were present there. And according to my claim, they were progressively lost in the development of critical theory. So that would be like to say, well, the first element, that is to say, the common language for collaboration, was kind of put in question by the dialectic of enlightenment, but the other three elements, they were present there, still present in the dialectic of enlightenment. So I then what I propose to you is to make a step of 40 years, more or less, and to say that from the mid-80s on, critical theory put in a secondary plan all the other three elements. That is to say, diagnosis of time, a strong concept of domination, and the idea that domination should be seen in research and in practice from the point of view of the processes of subjectivation of domination. So, of course, when I'm talking about mid-80s, I'm talking about Jürgen Habermas. And I'm saying that Jürgen Habermas made a radical move in this period that really dangerously made critical theory near traditional theory. And this is the problem until today. So this is the point where the idea of reconstruction, I don't know if you heard about this concept, that was put forward by Habermas in a book that he published in 1976. It's called For the Reconstruction of Historical Materialism. In English, it was published under a very different and strange name. But the idea of reconstruction becomes more and more central, so that you have, for instance, Axel Honneth's book from 2011, Freedom's Right, that says, well, reconstruction is the central concept of critical theory. So you can say that you have like a reconstructive paradigm in critical theory. And you know, I'm linking two things here. I'm saying that reconstruction and this move into abstraction and into losing these four basic elements that I pointed out here to you, they go together. So I know that all that I said here was really abstract. I hope it becomes less abstract during my presentation. So I began with the beginning, that is to say, Karl Marx. So Marx didn't want to write a better theory than Ricardo or Adam Smith. He wanted to do a critique of political economy. This is very important because it says that critical theory is not in competition with traditional theory because it puts itself in another soil, the soil of the emancipated society. That's why the major exercise of critical theory is critique of political economy in this case. So I have some quotes of Marx that I will skip here, and of Lukács also, to go to Max Horkheimer in the 1930s and to say that all these presuppositions that I presented you so far, they were kind of sublimated by Max Horkheimer. So the first one was the union between theory and practice. If you look at the context, the political context of the 1920s and 1930s, you will surely remember that the workers' movement was divided into at least two major strands. So social democracy and communism. So the communist parties and social democratic parties. Not to mention anarchists and all other important strands. So what can you do with the principle of the union of theory and practice if the workers' movement itself is divided into irreconcilable ways of understanding emancipation? So what the Institute for Social Research did was to take a step back and to say, well, the union of theory and practice is now for us orientation to emancipation. That's what we should do. That is to say, we should keep a prudent distance to direct action. This was a very smart move, despite of all the tensions it provoked. It is one of the reasons why critical theory had so many important achievements. So, given this inaugural decision, the connection to Marxism and to the workers' movement was done through critique of political economy. So, and it was put in a very innovative way as this common language for interdisciplinary collaboration. Political economy occupied like the center of the constellation of disciplines that were involved. And Herbert Marcuse has a very interesting statement. He says, well, critique of political economy is not a single discipline. It's like the language we speak to understand ourselves in the critical theoretical field. So something like that. This model for collaboration Collaboration does not mean that we have agreement or consensus, nothing like that. So everyone that participates in this constellation of disciplines, in her or his own disciplines and everything, is elaborating a diagnosis of time and a critical theoretical model. And this is how this field works. It's not like consensus, union, or agreement, but as disputes, theoretical disputes, given this common soil. So what does theory mean in this case? In my view, theory is a way of making explicit the theoretical elements that are involved in your own diagnosis of time. This is theory for me. When you say that you have something like a theory of communicative action, for instance, you have already something that's dangerously near to a traditional theory. So, although the theory of communicative action is still something that I think it's far from what Habermas wrote afterwards, that especially in Between Facts and Norms from 1992, where I see this complete turn in his position and then in the critical theoretical field. So, this is the original model. And as I told you, I think this original model has had as central elements the necessity of producing a diagnosis of time, a strong concept of domination, and a domination understood mainly as processes of subjectivation of domination. So this sublimation of the union between theory and practice was largely assumed by all critical theorists along the time. So this is not the problem. It's of course something that brings a permanent tension into critical theory, but there are productive tensions and sterile tensions. And in this case, I think it's a very productive tension. So as I mentioned to you, when Horkheimer and Adorno in the 1940s, they tried to substitute the critique of political economy for a new anthropology as the common language for collaboration. They started a process that in the end, that is to say today, had as a result the marginalization of these central elements in my view. So there are some possibilities here. The first one would be to tell you now how Habermas, as the most preeminent and most important representative of critical theory from the 1980s on, moved in this abstract, even more and more abstract way of thinking theories. That is to say, when I say that, I say, well, not putting the diagnosis of time as central, not putting a strong concept of domination, not understanding domination as processes of subjectivation of domination. When this is a possibility to show you that. Of course, what I'm saying is that when you go from the dialectic of enlightenment on, what you have is different critical theorists that want to produce a common language for interdisciplinary collaboration, including Habermas. So he tried to do that during the 1970s, and especially in the theory of communicative action, to propose the common language for collaboration. Axel Honneth, when he wrote Struggle for Recognition in 1991, He was that, 91, was published too. Okay, it's the same year of Habermas. Yeah. When he did that, what he was trying to do is to put forward a common language for interdisciplinary collaboration. And you know, this is like fishing for people to work in this field with your theory. So you can be a member of my club and my theory, and then you will have a field for research. And as we know, it's not easy to operationalize the theory of communicative action, as it's not in the case of struggle for recognition. So there are two major deficits here. On the one hand, you have the struggle for who has the best theory, and on the other hand, you don't have really astonishing empirical researches that come out of these struggles. So I think it's sterile to do that. When you compare, I'm not comparing to something abstract, I'm comparing to the tradition of research that critical theory has. It's incredibly rich. If you look at the empirical research that was done around or in the Institute for Social Research, it's amazing. It's amazing what they did. In the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, and then, oh well, we began to have a problem in the 70s. So I see that as a consequence of this major turn that critical theory had. So I won't bother you with describing this move that was made by Habermas from the 80s on. There is a very, very important text by Habermas from 1985. It's called The Exhaustion of Utopic Energies. It's a huge title. I'm just giving you the headline. This marks for me the definitive turn of critical theory. And this is not a coincidence that Herbert Marcuse died in 1979. So this move was made after Marcuse died. And I will talk about Marcuse in a bit. So I won't do that, but if you want to discuss that, we can discuss how this major turn in the mid-1980s and on, from Habermas, Axel Honneth, and other people, how this shaped critical theory, how it is today, and also how we are reacting to this turn, I think, in the critical theoretical field. Or so I hope. So, I won't do that, so I'll go back to the dialectic of enlightenment and try to say, well, if you don't have an union between theory and practice, that is to say, if your relation to social movements and to the workers' movement is done by the orientation to emancipation, how can you relate to praxis? How can you make this relation? So, in the dialectic of enlightenment, that was the most influential diagnosis of time and most influential concept of domination for decades in the field of critical theory, you didn't have much room for action. So, there is a famous quote by Adorno when he says, well, if you do something against domination, its present form, not domination in general, if you do something against it, you will have to use the same evil characters of the present domination. That is to say, if you go against instrumental reason, you will have to use instrumental reason. So, if you go against domination, you will have to use the same tools that domination uses to dominate. This is one side of the quote. The second is, and you are not less guilty if you don't do anything. So, if you do something, it will be affected by the evilness of domination. If you don't do anything, you are really a bad person. So, you don't have any alternative. So, this was the framework of dialect of enlightenment. And with this framework, it should be clear that critical theory would disappear as a tradition. Because if you have a really good book, but at the same time saying that, well, we can't do much with what we wrote and what we researched, then with time you will just disappear as critical theory. Because if you have any connection to emancipation, you have to have some connection to emancipatory movements. If you don't have, then you are not critical theory. So, or at least that's how I think about it. You can be a very interesting academic line of research. That's okay. But critical theory in its origins, well, this is another thing. But then came some people, and especially one guy, Herbert Marcuse, who made a move towards the new emancipatory movements, especially in the 60s and in the 70s. And Marcuse made, he made this abstract concepts of the dialectic of enlightenment some important tools for political action. Even if you say, well, Marcuse was not directly involved in any movement, he was all the time trying to theorize about these movements, and was at the same time producing diagnoses of time that were really, really influential. So one of the side claims I have today is to say, well, if it were not for Herbert Marcuse, we would not be talking about critical theory today. But this move made by Marcuse, from which Jürgen Habermas also profited, because he was also under the wings of Marcuse when he wrote the theory of communicative action. If you look at a very important text by Habermas, it's called Technique and Science as Ideology from 1968. It's dedicated to Marcuse. So, when Marcuse died, this Marcusean moment of critical theory got lost. And critical theory became, I think, more and more abstract and academic. In the bad sense, in the sense that you go with the logic of academic competition. So this is what happened in my view during this time, and this is why it's so important to go back to, not to, of course, to repeat what Marcuse said word by word, but to see that if critical theory does not address these 4 points, that is to say, if it does not give centrality to the diagnosis of time, if it does not build another strong concept of domination, if it does not pay attention to the processes of subjectivation of domination, it will disappear. And it's a possibility. It will disappear as an interesting intellectual strand. It will remain in academia, and we will write reports for the agencies to say that we read Adorno and Habermas very well and that we can understand their concepts. But it's not interesting in the sense of the origins of critical theory, particularly when you think about this innovative model of interdisciplinarity that was put forward by this tradition, not other one. If you think about the rich amount of research that has been done for 40 years at least in this tradition, either we go back to this or critical theory will just disappear as an interesting field for research and for practice. So, of course, what I'm saying here is also that if you get to make a move, in the sense that you call the critical theoretical field to say, well, we have to put the diagnosis of time as the main task of critical theory. And we should, as a field, make explicit disputes about diagnosis of time. There is also the hope that this discussion will lead us to new common languages for collaboration. So, I hope that my claim is right. What I'm trying to say here is that if you put the common language for collaboration as a previous requirement for someone to get into critical theory, you won't have anything interesting to present. But if you try to build common languages for interdisciplinary collaboration that come out of the disputes between different diagnoses of time, then you have some hope that this diagnosis of time, these disputes will produce these common languages for collaboration. And you will have also the necessity of bringing back a strong concept of domination. So I'll come now to the final part of my presentation, and I want to address the present situation of the critical theoretical field. So, if we take, the underlying claim here is that if critical theory does not follow emancipatory social movements, then it's not critical theory. So, from the 1970s on, social movements expanded the horizon of emancipation to target not only emancipation from capital, but also from previously fixed models of society. When the social movements did that, the logic of transformation has been altered. So it's not like the model of the French Revolution or of the Russian Revolution, but it's another way of making transformation and revolution from below. This new image of transformation was and is something that critical theory should address. As I said to you, Habermas and also Axel Honneth and other critical theorists thought that reconstruction would be the right way to address such transformations. Can you compare reconstruction with exploitation? Let's think about exploitation. The fundamental concept in the sense that it pointed to transformation that was put forward by Marx. Can you come to a social movement and say, let's reconstruct? That's not possible. So what happened to critical theory? Why don't we have a new concept of exploitation? Why don't we have a new concept of expropriation, for instance? I see that as, of course, linked to some diagnosis of time that were put forward by Axel Honneth and Jürgen Habermas, among others, that say, well, present societies are radically changing, and they are changing for worse. What we should do is to protect what we have with all the energies we have. Well, I don't think that they would agree with me that this is their diagnosis of time, but I think I can prove it. So, what is a diagnosis of time that says, well, the trend of historical development is that things are getting worse and we have to protect what we have. So this is also a way of going even more abstract all the time. If you look at Between Facts and Norms, just to give you an example, this book of Habermas from 1992, you have a strong defense of the separation of powers, of the traditional separation of powers in the traditional rule of law of a democratic society. So, is that really the task that critical theory should do? To justify the separation of powers in democracy? This is what we should do as critical theorists? Well, not to mention that I think that this is false as a theory, but this is another thing. What is important today is to see that the moves that were made by social movements in the 1970s and also in the 2000s, we could say, they showed clearly that domination is multidimensional and that critical theory should address such multidimensionality of domination. And of course, also to think about complex processes of subjectivation of domination. So, we cannot take for granted that advances in promoting equality would automatically result in advances in promoting freedom. For instance, we cannot assume that the way in which things are going, the tendencies and the trends that are to be seen today are only trends that make us, that put us in a defensive position. If we put ourselves in a defensive position, the result will be in time that we will lose what we have. So if you put yourself as a critical theorist and as an activist and as a political engaged person, if you put yourself in a defensive position, you will see that this is impossible to hold what you were trying to defend. So I think that other than these positions in critical theory that I think are dominant from the mid-80s, 1980s to now, that they have been challenged by some critical theorists that I think are showing us a new path in the field. So the first one would be Nancy Fraser. Nancy Fraser is I think the first critical theorist that really said what we have to do is diagnosis of time. We have to do that. And this must be central. Well, you will see that in Axel Honneth's book too, Freedom's Right. You see that. But if you look at the book, what he calls the diagnosis of time is just an illustration of the theory. So you take some examples to say, you see, I'm right. Well, this is not what a complex diagnosis of time requires, I think. I don't think that you can quote a novel as an argument for the expansion of freedom or something like that. But okay, would be another discussion. So Nancy Fraser would be an example. I think most of you know her. There is also a critical theorist with the name of Amy Allen, who published a book in 2016. It's called The End of Progress, in which, for instance, Amy Allen tries to acknowledge the challenges that are put forward by post-colonial and decolonial theories and say, well, critical theory can't ignore that. That means also that critical theory should pay attention to the processes of subjectivation of domination. Not just pay attention again and put it as central, a concept of domination, but also to see the many dimensions and the many challenges that are put forward for critical theory, and not to dismiss these challenges as not pertaining to critical theory. And it's also to say, if you take a look, for instance, in a book by Habermas from 1985, this is the year where I see this shift, as I told you. It's called The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity. And it's like we say in Brazil, there are two major football teams in Rio de Janeiro, Flamengo and Fluminense. And we say always that when you reduce a theoretical dispute to a football game, and we say that as fla-flu, then you don't get much further. And I think that's what happened with this book. Habermas said, we critical theorists, we have to fight Foucault and fight him with all we have. No. We are on the same broad field. Why would I fight Foucault? There are so many people to fight. He's a great ally. We shouldn't do that. So either critical theory as a field understands itself as a part of a larger, broader field, I would call it social critique or something like that, or it will disappear, become irrelevant. So we have here Sergio Costa, who does that empirically. So and many other people. I just wanted to point out that there are developments, there are researches and tentatives in the critical theory, in the critical theoretical field to address such problems that I am trying to point out. To come to the end, I would just say that of course I'm not saying that systematizing and refining concepts in their ties to broad theories is not an important task. What I'm saying is that this task has gained autonomy in relation to the other tasks that critical theory should also do. And the very concept of domination must be included in such critical theoretical work. But when the question is reduced to presenting the best theory, well, I have the best theory or the best critical theory, when it becomes the primary and the leading objective, it winds up sidelining the fundamental task of producing the most accurate diagnosis of time. Similarly, this is not to ignore the relevance of many of the aims set by the strategies that were developed by Habermas, by Axel Honneth, and other theorists. But is to say that if the relation between theory and practice for critical theory has always been one of attention, you cannot just ignore that there are many differences and many novelties in social movements that should be addressed by critical theory. I just remind you that in the 1960s and 1970s, when new social movements, they looked for theoretical developments, they looked for diagnosis of time, they found them in critical theory. And please, take a look at the 2011 democratic revolts all around the world. Did you see any critical theoretical concept in play? No. Nobody was saying, well, critical theory is a reservoir of concepts and ideas that we can use for practice. Nothing. Nobody cried, let's reconstruct. Nobody said that. So this is a problem. Establishing theories or the best theory or avoiding practice in the way that it's been done until today means that the main tasks and main objectives of critical theory must change. If we want to overcome this lamentable state of underdetermination in which a notion as central as that of domination finds itself today, relies on a collective movement toward producing and confronting different diagnoses of time through the lens of a multi-dimensional perspectives on the subjectivation of domination, with an eye to the new practices of protest, of resistance, and social transformation. It's really hard to see another way for critical theory to re-establish the unique connection to practice that characterizes it and sets apart critical theory from traditional ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcos Nobre, for this really brilliant overview and at the same time a deep analysis of some challenges and also dilemmas critical theory has faced in recent times, as used in other lectures. without to abuse my function as a moderator, chair of the session, I would start with the questions, and then before you, once I would collect more questions, if you agree. Actually, I have a lot of questions, but I will reduce the questions to 2 questions in order to save time for discussion. The first question is related to your diagnosis of some failures of critical theory. And my question would be, if you don't find a very complicated name for a much more simple thing. If you say critical theory has failed in producing diagnosis of times and also to have a strong concept of domination. I would say a strong concept of domination is there. If you take some concepts such as colonization of life force, it's a strong concept of domination. Also, misrespect, misrecognition, as in Axel Honneth. What I think is missed is actually something quite simple. It's the abandonment of the critique of capitalism, so the material dimension of domination. This is what I think is perhaps the main failure of some critical theories for not to do this. And I think this failure is more simple to fix than the other aspect I'd like to highlight in my second questions. If you take the work of Rachel Yegi or Nancy Fraser, they are doing exactly this, classical capitalism critique of capitalism. So in that way, my question would be, if this is for the points you are mentioned, if this is not a real answer, a real response to this gap, to this failure. The second failure, you also mentioned in your presentation, I think it's not a failure, it's a challenge, I would say, and this is much more complicated. If your, let me provoke you, if your dream is to have critical theory as hegemonic field, as hegemonic force in the field of critique in our contemporary world, I don't see any chance to achieve this dream. It's, of course, comparisons are risky, but to me, it's the same if you try to make PT again the hegemonic forces in the field of leftist forces in Brazil, just to start with a provocation. Because I think critiques to the critical theory coming from post-colonial studies, from some feminist theories, and also from queer theories, it's much more radical than at least you mentioned in your presentation. And they are actually addressing some crucial assumptions of critical theory, such as the idea that theory is somehow universal knowledge. Even if you have a kind of alliance between theory and praxis, theory is posed by critical theorists in another level. And this is exactly what authors such as, I don't know, Bab and others say, we have to construct a narrative beyond theory in order to break this distinction between theory and praxis. Because you have to narrate experiences. This is the role of social sciences and humanities. You can agree or not, but just to mention that this is a radical critique, I don't see any chance to co-opt this critique in the field of critical theory. And also the whole legacy of enlightenment, and to not take into account the to call the title of a book, The Dark Side of Enlightenment, with colonialism, slavery. If critical theory doesn't take into account this, I don't see any chance to really overcome the deficits you very sharply mentioned. So, but I'd like to open for questions. I don't know if, you have a microphone, yeah. If you please can also say your name and institution, yeah.
I'm Italo from the Catholic University in Porto Alegre, the Department of Philosophy. And well, I'm still formulating the question in my head, so I excuse myself if it comes out a little unclear. Professor Nobre, I understand your diagnosis that critical theory has sort of lost centrality on the concept of domination recently, and but what I lack from your, what I missed from your presentation is what are the reasons for that? And I'm asking that because we know some answers for that question, and most of them say, for example, that critical theory is has its grounds on the society it analyzes. So if society changes, critical theory has to change too. And it can go from simple moves, such as not using the concept of ideology, for example, anymore, because it's a very highly normatively charged concept. And for example, Professor Pinzani says that if we still use the concept of ideology, we're basically presupposing a subject that is imbecile, that doesn't have agency, that is not aware of the forces that constrain their behavior, basically. Or we can go further and say, such as Frederick Jameson, that we cannot even speak of theory anymore, because the current state of knowledge doesn't allow us to speak of a systematized or of a system of knowledge, such as what a theory would be. And then we would speak instead of thought, for example, critical thought, which is a more dispersed way of thinking critically. And I'd like to hear from you what you think are the causes for this loss of centrality of the concept, if you could make it more explicit. And the second question, if I may, is you say that the concept of reconstruction has gained centrality instead, and it sort of came out as being the central concept in critical theory after Habermas, mostly. And I'd like to ask if this has not, hasn't it always been the case that reconstruction was maybe not the central concept, but one central concept in critical theory? I mean, because I read, for example, Honneth speaking of the difference between constructivist theories and reconstructivist ones, and I understand that as he is speaking of a difference between more Kantian-influenced theories, such as John Rawls, as opposed to more Hegel-influenced ones, such as most strands of critical theory. And yeah, well, these are my questions. Thank you.
Perhaps we can close this round there, and then we open a second round of questions. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, Sergio, that's exactly what I wanted to do. So thank you for clarifying, if it was not clear. A strong concept of domination is... a strong concept of domination is a topic of chapter. I'm sorry if it was not clear. From what I said, I hoped it was when I talked about exploitation and expropriation. So we agree on that. This is good. I don't think the colonization of the life word or disrespect are strong concepts of domination. I don't think so. So that's the problem I see in them. So the other thing is, I don't know where you got this megalomaniac project of making critical theory the hegemonic force in the field. I just don't want it to disappear. That's another thing. It's in the risk of becoming irrelevant. So it's not the case. And the comparison with PT is really, I don't think where you got this, because, well, we could discuss PT, but PT has nothing to do with critical theory. And one of the major problems, I think, of the Workers' Party in Brazil is really that it never thought it was important to have critical debates. And the Workers' Party was maybe the only left party in the world that didn't found a school, that didn't have a paper. And I mean, it is anti-intellectual all the time, so I don't see the connection. What I was trying to do is to say that we should look at Marcuse's example. That's what I said. Marcuse didn't want to be hegemonic. He didn't want to be, that critical theory should be hegemonic. He just wanted to be in the debate. That's why I said that in the broader field of social critique, critical theory should also have its place. That's all. I mean, it's a bunch of people. I mean, it's not like an army. It's just a contribution. On the other hand, we could discuss further if critical theory is taking the challenges put by post-colonial or queer theory seriously. I think it is. And of course, the problem of universality is all the time there. If you look at Amy Allen's book, you will find there this is the major problem for her, because she says, well, we can have the concept of progress like it was before. The title of the book, The End of Progress, comes from a quote from Adorno. Adorno says, progress begins when it ends. So this is the major idea. But what she's saying is that critical theory has to have this this orientation to emancipation. So this is what distinguishes critical theory from other positions in this broader field of social critique. And I think it's a problem for us. And I hope we can address that properly. So Italo, about ideology. This is, of course, Habermas, in this article from 1968, he put ideology in, what's the name for that? Quotation marks, yeah. He put it in quotation marks. That means a lot. It means if you want to use ideology, it's just in this quotation mark sense. And Adorno at almost the same time said, well, ideology is not a veil anymore. It is just the threatening face of the word. So this is a change that critical theory made in the 60s. That's very important. That is to say, well, if you want to use the word, you have to use it in another sense, not in the sense that something is veiled, of course. And this has a lot to do with your other question, with Reconstruction. So in the 70s, Habermas made the same move that Pierre Bourdieu made in sociology. So to say, you can have this normative theory in your head and then tell people what the right society is. And in terms of research, you can't just bring objective concepts to the field and apply them to the field. You have to have these practices that emanate from day life, that give you the categories according to which actors operate, actors act. So this was the move made at the same time by Bourdieu and by Habermas. What Habermas said was the main aim of critical theory is to reconstruct these deep structures that produce norms in everyday life. That's what reconstruction is about. So I would see it as a similar move as that made in traditional theory by Bourdieu, because for me, Bourdieu is traditional theory, a very good one. This is one thing, to say that, well, this is a move that is very important for critical theory in the sense that you have to change your way of doing research and of seeing society. That's one thing. Another thing is to take this general idea and then to put it as a central concept. You mentioned Axel Honneth, and Axel Honneth tries to say, well, everybody in critical theory was reconstructive. Try to tell Marx that. I mean, this is crazy. Of course, it's very well done, it's beautifully written by Axel Honneth, but it's nothing to do with this tradition. He's just trying to say, well, critical theory is the same as reconstruction, and there are two strands here. Habermas, who is a Kantian, and me, who am a Hegelian. And this is critical theory. Well, if critical theory is reconstruction, then what do we have to say about what's going on in the basis of society with social movements and everything? Nothing. I mean, this does not mean that you don't have to have this elaboration of concepts. Of course, it's the main task of critical theorists to elaborate concepts according to a diagnosis of time. What I'm saying is critical theory from the mid-80s on is more and more abstract all the time. And what good can this do? I don't see. I don't see what reconstruction can bring to make us reconnect in this particular sense of reconnection of critical theory to practice. That is to say, not direct action, but in the sense that you are trying to theoretically elaborate what's going on in social movements. We are not doing that anymore for 40 years. And I think it's a huge mistake.
So we still have time for a second round of questions. This is over there. Is, yeah. Maybe I can perhaps comment on the PT. I think the idea is not to say that the PT is the representative of critical theory in the political field, but the aspiration, the claim for being the hegemonic force in the field of the left in Brazil is why I was comparing with critical theory, defining there are critical theorists and are traditional theorists. So this is also a kind of division of the field claiming for hegemony. But
yeah, it's nothing to do. Really.
Thank you for the presentation.
Can you speak louder, please? Yeah.
My name is Marina Chen. I'm from the Coventry University in the UK and originally from Taiwan. I'm interested in what you said about the critical theory is towards emancipation. That is number one point. And secondly, you talk about the diagnosis of time. And in the context of school here, and we're learning in school or in universities, I would like to ask or kind of invite to give us an indication how we bring these two elements into universities to actually help us to create an environment and create space for using critical theory with the 2 points you mentioned with different disciplines. Because at a lot of time we kind of talk about that, but how that make it very relevant and make it accessible for different disciplines to participate and also contribute to this diagnosis and also put into action. Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Travis Knoll from third year history PhD student at Duke University in the US. So, yeah, we've we deal with a lot of critical theory in our literature department, obviously, and I'm less versed in that because I'm a historian. But my question is, where do you think the reticence to engage emancipatory movements in our own research, and not just in our research, but that means going from participation in emancipatory movements to the formation of our own critical theories. Where do you think the reticence to do that comes from? We heard a talk 2 days ago that emphasized the necessity for critical distance from our research subjects. Where do you stand in that debate? Is there a way to balance those two, or do you have to make a choice whether you put critical distance or whether you actually draw your knowledge from emancipatory movements, as some activist anthropologists have suggested one needs to do? Thank you.
Thank you.
Further questions? Okay, then.
Okay. So, thanks so much for the questions. This is a proposal, what I'm making. It's a proposal to say, well, if you are an economist or a sociologist or an anthropologist or a psychoanalysis researcher or a philosopher, try to go to the field of the diagnosis of time with the spirit of having in the horizon building a new strong concept of domination, one that's multi-dimensional. What would you have to say about what's going on? You know, if you have this kind of critique of capitalism from every side, from every discipline, maybe we can find some common ground in critical theory for interdisciplinary collaboration. Because the problem is that from the 40s on, there is always a philosopher that comes and says, well, I have the common language for collaboration. Just follow me. And this is the problem. We should do it the other way. So I don't know what your field of research is, but if you are an economist, I would say, well, in the 19th century, Marx said, well, according to my diagnosis of time, there is a trend in capitalism of auto-destruction. That doesn't mean that it will destruct itself. This is a major mistake. But it has a prospect for action. And the prospect for action was the following. The workers' movement should fight for a reduced journey of work, like 8 hours, to have paid vacation, to have Sunday as a day of not working. And all these major claims that were made by the workers' movement. At the same time, that you see that this would improve the life of people, it would also speed the decline of capitalism. You see? So, if you are an economist, I would say, please help us in this. Is this a new concept of exploitation that we need? There is, for instance, in Lapavitsas, an economist, he says, well, we have the concept of expropriation now that is linked to financialization, as Professor Lavinas will tell us. So we need that. If you are a psychoanalyst, you can say, well, what is the structure of psyche today? And what do you see as these major movements, in these major social movements? What do they have to do with some forms of pathology? You know? So this is a proposal. Let's not compete for the best theory. Let's compete for the best diagnosis of time. And in the way that we can collaborate from our own disciplines with something. And maybe we can rebuild this. Because I think it was almost erased by this idea of Reconstruction and by Habermas and Honneth. They are great thinkers. I mean, there is no question about that. But we don't need that right now, I think. This would be my answer. It's not a good answer, but it's what I have. So you use the word dilemma, I don't know, about participation and research. I mean, this move made by Horkheimer in the 1930s to say, well, there is no clear union between theory and practice anymore. That's why we have to sublimate it into an orientation to emancipation. This was a great move because it avoids this question, I think. It prevents us from having this dilemma between participation and doing research or theoretizing. In which sense? In the sense that I don't have to agree with social movements. For instance, if you have here Professor Machado, who made a research about anti-racist movements, and there is a lot of from the results, you can see that there are many social movements that are claiming for incarceration, that are claiming for punishment with prison. And I mean, if you fight for a liberated society, you fight against prisons and imprisonment and incarceration. How can an emancipatory movement make the claim to incarcerate people? So you have a kind of distance that you were asking for. And when you said, well, someone here said we must keep a critical distance. This is the critical distance, because if you don't have the union, but you have the orientation to emancipation, you can have this critical distance, not in the sense that you are just observing. This is not possible for critical theory. But in the sense that you were not the movement, although you can participate. You were not, as Sergio was accusing me here, of trying to make critical theory hegemonic or something like that. It's the opposite. It's just how can critical theory and its particular perspective contribute to emancipatory struggles? That's all. If it does not change, it will not contribute. And then I think it would be a shame. It would be a great loss, because it's a unique perspective, I think.
Okay, thank you very much again, Professor Marcos Nobre, for this really illuminating lecture, and also for the inspiring and also engaged discussion. We should be start again at 2 o'clock please sharp, because you have really a full program also in the afternoon. I see you again at 2 o'clock in this room. Thank you.